Good afternoon, and thank you, Dina and Annie. Today I'll be talking to you a little bit about domestic violence among married women in India and how addressing domestic violence is critical for addressing HIV in the Indian context. And that our first step in doing so was the development of the Indian Family Violence and Control Scale. This work is largely a collaboration between Emory University as well as the National AIDS Research Institute in Pune, India. So, as all of you know, domestic violence is universal across countries, across regions, across populations. But there are certain manifestations of domestic violence that are country-specific. And so here I provide the Indian legal definition of domestic violence. So domestic violence is defined by the Indian Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, states that domestic violence is physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, and economic abuse against a woman by a partner or family member within a shared household or joint family. So when we think of the intersections of domestic violence and HIV in India, 36% of married Indian women report lifetime physical or sexual abuse by an intimate partner. And that experience of physical and sexual intimate partner violence is linked to an almost fourfold higher odds of HIV infection, as shown by Silverman in 2008. So why might there be this increased HIV risk? Well, women who experience violence have been shown to have reduced condom use, increased sexually transmitted infections, more high-risk partners, often multiple partners, and engage in substance abuse. So this speaks to the need for addressing domestic violence to address HIV in the context of India, and prior to doing so, the need for an effective instrument to measure domestic violence in the Indian context. So when we think about measuring domestic violence or what goes into a domestic violence estimate, there are several different things. The first is the study setting and perceived safety of the person that you're interviewing. The perpetrator that you survey, whether it's just an intimate partner or also a mother-in-law, father-in-law, etc. The study population that you're studying, the different types of domestic violence, and the multitude of forms you study, whether you're just looking at physical violence or also physical, sexual, and emotional, etc. The time frame of study, cultural and socioeconomic determinants of domestic violence acceptance, where in certain cultures where violence is more accepted, that reporting may actually be higher. And then methodology that you use, whether you're using computer-assisted interviews versus face-to-face interviews, and then the interviewer themselves. So all of these different variables you can see can cause a large variation in the actual estimate of domestic violence. So when we look at the most recent estimates of domestic violence in India, which were provided by the National Family Health Survey, as I reported, was around 36%. This was the scale that they had used. It's a WHO scale that is an abridged version of the conflict tactics scale. And when you look at it, you can see maybe why underreporting of domestic violence may actually be there in India. So the first is they asked about husband. And in India, the family structure is often a woman, when she's married, she moves into a joint family. And whether or not she moves into the joint family and lives alone with her husband, there's often influence from the marital family or in-law family on their lives. Second, knife and gun violence. Well, in India, if you pick up the newspaper, you rarely read of gun violence or knife violence, but rather other forms of severe violence like burning or chemical use. So that may not be as appropriate a question. And then sexual intercourse. Where discussion of sexual education is largely tabooed in the schools, you can understand how this question, unless better explained, may not be able to get to the answer that you're trying to look for. And then also only 3 questions that address psychological abuse or control, which is widespread in India. So based on this, our hypothesis was that the currently available domestic violence scales are inadequate for measuring domestic violence in the Indian context. And our aim was first to develop a culturally tailored scale to effectively measure domestic violence among married women in Pune, India, and then second, to validate the scale among married women in Pune as well. And just to go through our methods briefly, so this is a mixed method study, the first phase of which was formative phase, and the second phase, which was the quantitative phase in which we tested the item pool. So in the formative phase, we first conducted an in-depth interview of the past 10 years of the domestic violence literature in India. Second, looked at in-depth interviews with domestic violence experts in the community, as well as focus groups with community members. And then, based on that, triangulating all three of those methods, we developed an item pool, which was field pre-tested and reviewed by different experts in the domestic violence field, as well as by the National AIDS Research Institute Ethics Committee, to develop the Indian Family Violence and Control Scale. And then the scale was preliminarily validated among 630 women in Pune to get to the initial psychometrics of the scale. So just for those of you who don't know much about Pune, India, it's located in the state of Maharashtra with a population of 3.1 million. Age of 62%, approximately 62% are under the age of 30. The female to male sex ratio is 0.945. And literacy, 95% of men report being literate and 88% of women. 32% of the population falls below the poverty line with a mean age of marriage of 20.6 years. And the only estimates of domestic violence in Pune until we had conducted the study was that the national estimates of urban regions in Maharashtra, which was 33.4%, and there was one study in Pune slums which suggested that 61.5% of married women in the slums experienced physical IPV. So this is the National AIDS Research Institute in Pune, where we conducted the work, and for those of you who don't know, it was established over 20 years ago, and it's really been a nodal HIV research center for the Indian Council of Medical Research. This was our study team, my two mentors, Dr. Seema Sahai and Carlos Del Rio. And on the bottom left is Ratna Prabha Poddar, who really spearheaded the qualitative phase of the study, and on the bottom right, our field team of quantitative study team members as well. So just briefly to go through the in-depth review of the literature. So we looked at quantitative studies published between 2002 and 2012 that surveyed about the different types of forms of domestic violence to just get an idea of what type of questions were being asked and whether or not they used validated scales. And just to kind of bring you up to speed with these two graphs, on the left you see those reporting a lifetime prevalence of domestic violence, and on the right, prior 12-month prevalence of intimate partner violence. And each dot that you see represents a different study. So probably the largest thing to take note of from these two graphs is the large spread of prevalence estimates provided across the board, psychological, physical, sexual violence between studies. With only 1/3 of studies using a validated domestic violence instrument, and usually those were often developed in Western contexts, such as the conflict tactics scale, index of spouse abuse, and abuse assessment scale. So then on to our qualitative phase of in-depth interviews and focus groups. So we conducted 16 key informant interviews with community psychiatrists, gynecologists, female police commissioners, domestic violence and human rights lawyers, NGO leaders, sociologists, anthropologists, religious leaders, including Islamic mufti, Hindu gurujis, as well as a Catholic priest, HIV domestic violence, and family court counselors. We did conduct 2 gender concordant focus groups among women as well as men. And what we asked in these qualitative interviews was about different examples of domestic violence and forms of domestic violence that individuals had encountered through their work or through their knowledge of happenings in the community, strategies and barriers to asking about domestic violence, differences in domestic violence by setting, socioeconomic status, age, marital duration, and prevention strategies. So our results were really that the major themes from this qualitative sub-study came into play for the development of the Indian Family Violence and Control Scale. First was that there was multiple perpetrators, that it often wasn't only the husband, often the mother-in-law and father-in-law, as has been reported in prior studies. The need for introductory rapport-building questions prior to administration of the scale. The widespread normalization and acceptance of domestic violence, so really to ask very targeted questions, asking about psychological violence and control. And then differences by region, socioeconomic status, age, marital duration, and profession, highlighting the need for extensive validation even after the first phase. And then most importantly, it highlighted numerous different forms of violence that were not commonly found in currently available scales. And This really resulted in the 63-question item pool that was subsequently developed. So here you can see the 4 different types of violence that you commonly encounter. So among psychological, what was in a way unique to the culture was this, a woman being sent to her maher, so being sent to her natal family home against her will, being harassed for manban, which are wedding-related gifts, dowry, harassment for having a girl child, harassment for infertility, and then having threats to her maternal family home. In terms of physical violence, being tried to be poisoned, burnt using cigarettes, kerosene, chemicals, and acids, being threatened or attacked with a belt, stone, broomstick, or rolling pin, being forced to work excessively to the point of exhaustion. Among sexual violence, being forced to have sex against her will during her menses, pregnancy, or with somebody else, being forced to replicate a sexual behavior from a pornographic film, being forced videotaping of her sexual intercourse, and then being threatened to sexually abuse family members for her refusing sex. And in terms of control and isolation, preventing a woman from spending money on her children, natal family, and friends, preventing visits of her natal family and friends, being forced to leave a job or take up a job, and limiting her family planning decisions, restricting or stalking her phone, text messages, emails, social networking, and then asking her to change her appearance, her diet from vegetarian to non-veg, or forcing her to perform upas or fasting. So these items were then reviewed, first pre-tested among 10 female NARI staff members and our affiliated NGO peers. And based on that, we received feedback from the peers and staff members regarding numerous afternoon disruptions, such as the water would turn on, and so a woman's afternoon chores would take precedence, her children coming home. And so it led to the study staff developing strategies for how to best overcome that. Difficulty with the Likert scale, which was initially 7 items in length, was subsequently shorter to 4 to 5 items. And then translation issues. So when we translated the scales from English to Marathi or English to Hindi, the word friend became boyfriend. So mitra, instead of saying mitra and maitrin, which would change the response of the individual. And then participant desire to explain their answers. So not just being okay saying yes, it occurs frequently or not frequently, but really they want to explain themselves. So that led to us having a debriefing at the end of each scale administration. And then lastly, as you can see at the bottom, it led to a change in the formatting of the actual scale. So this preliminary Indian family violence and control scale was subsequently tested in the quantitative phase to 630 women in Pune, India. And this was administered to a random, geographically clustered sample of married women in 16 different wards across Pune. 94% of the scale was administered in Marathi, 5% was administered in Hindi, and 1% in English. 96% were verbal, 2% written, and 2% both verbal and written. And then we used 3 different scale versions, all with differing item order, to see if item order in fact affected their response. So our sample demographics, the average age was 35, 78% were Hindu, 12% Buddhist, 7% Muslim, and 2% Christian, 1% Jain. 42% were employed. Roughly a third had less than primary or 7th grade education, 28% 8th to 10th standard education, and 39% over 8th standard education. Looking at monthly family income, approximately 19% had less than rupees 6,000, 30% between 6 to 10,000, and 44% had over 10,000. The average marital age was 15 years, 87% were arranged, 98% it was their first marriage, and roughly 60 to 40 distribution of nuclear to joint families. And then below you can find the demographics of the participant's husband. The average age was 39, 93% were employed, less than 1/3 had primary education, 29% between 8th and 10th standard, and over 44% had over secondary education. So looking at the initial psychometrics, the control scale subscale alpha was 0.84, for psychological DV subscale is 0.88, for the physical 0.85, and sexual 0.70. Initial evaluation of construct validity did demonstrate that it has good correlation with the conflict tactic scale modules, as well as established DV correlates including education, family income, number of pregnancies, and age of participant and first child in housing materials. And neither scale language nor administration order affected the response. So lastly, my conclusions and future directions. So initial evaluation of the scale does show that it has both good internal consistency as well as construct validity. It will require much more further widespread validation, such as in rural and tribal areas and other populations in regions within India. And hopefully we can use the scale to then develop and evaluate strategies to further evaluate domestic violence prevention strategies, including those for HIV high risk and positive women in India. So I just want to say thank you. This effort was largely a large group of individuals at NARI. Dr. Seema Sai, again, my mentor, thanks to Ramesh Varanspe, who's the director of NARI, the qualitative team, quantitative team, and data management team. And then my mentors at Emory University, Temple, and of course the study participants. That's all. Thank you.